It's the word no young dreamer wants to hear. And for three young boys in Manchester, it came loud and clear under the harsh lights of a small-town stage. The Gibb brothers, Barry, Robin, and Maurice, were barely old enough to understand the word fame, but they understood the sting of rejection. It was their first real performance in front of an audience, their first chance to prove themselves. They had practiced endlessly, their hearts racing with hope, but when the music stopped and the judges delivered their verdict, it wasn't applause they carried home, it was humiliation. The Bee Gees, before they were the Bee Gees, lost their very first talent show. And yet, here's the mystery. That loss should have crushed them. It should have ended the story before it ever began. Instead, it did the opposite. It lit a fire that would never go out. How does a single moment of failure turn into the fuel for one of the greatest musical journeys of all time? Tonight, we go back to the beginning, to a small stage, three nervous boys, and the night they lost everything, only to gain the confidence that would carry them into history. If you love uncovering the forgotten beginnings and hidden struggles of music legends, make sure you subscribe to RetroWaves. Here, every story peels back the curtain to reveal the moments nobody else dares to tell. The story of the Bee Gees often begins with the glitter of disco, the flashing lights of Studio 54, or the unforgettable soundtrack of Saturday Night Fever. But to understand who they really were, you have to strip all that away and go back to the years when they were just children, restless and unknown, searching for a voice. Barry, the eldest, was born in 1940. Robin and Maurice, the twins, followed 3 years later. Together they were mischievous, full of energy, and inseparable. Their father, Hugh Gibb, was a band leader who passed down both his love of music and the belief that performance could change lives. Their mother, Barbara, believed in their talent but knew the world could be cruel. By the mid-1950s, Manchester was gray and rough, still recovering from the war. For children like the Gibbs, opportunities were scarce, and the idea of stardom was almost unthinkable. Still, the boys loved to sing together, imitating the harmonies they heard on the radio. So when they heard about a local talent show at the Gaumont Cinema, they begged their parents to let them perform. For them, this wasn't just a game. It was a chance to be heard, a chance to step out of the shadows and show the world what they had inside. But what awaited them on that stage wasn't glory. It was the kind of harsh lesson that could either end a dream or sharpen it. The night of the performance, Barry carried his guitar, Robin clutched the lyrics, Maurice followed nervously. They weren't polished, they weren't trained, they were just kids with raw ambition. And in the eyes of the judges, they weren't ready. They lost. But the story didn't end there, because the way they reacted to that loss is the real beginning of the Bee Gees. The cinema was packed with neighbors, parents, and restless kids. It wasn't Madison Square Garden, it wasn't the Hollywood Bowl, but for Barry, Robin, and Maurice, it might as well have been. They stepped onto the stage, trembling, the lights hot on their faces. The audience murmured. No one expected much from three skinny boys with hand-me-down clothes and too much nervous energy. Barry strummed his guitar, the twins joined in, and together their voices rose. It wasn't perfect. Robin's voice cracked, Maurice struggled to find his pitch, and Barry tried desperately to hold them together. But there was something undeniable, a glimmer of harmony, a spark of magic that even they didn't fully understand yet. The crowd was polite, some clapped, some chuckled, and when it was over, the judges gave their verdict. The Gibb brothers had lost. For most kids, that might have been the end. Embarrassment, shame, a reason never to try again. But for the Gibbs, something strange happened. Instead of shrinking, they felt a rush. The thrill of being on stage outweighed the sting of defeat. They had sung in front of strangers and survived. They had faced fear, and it hadn't destroyed them. Walking home that night, they weren't broken, they were alive, and in that feeling was a promise: we'll be back. Failure has two choices. It can close a door, or it can ignite defiance. For the Gibb brothers, it was the latter. Barry, only 9 at the time, told his brothers something that stayed with them forever. We didn't lose, we started. That defiance was their secret weapon. While other children moved on with school, sports, or mischief, the Gibbs poured themselves into music. They practiced endlessly in their small home, harmonizing late into the night until Barbara would beg them to sleep. Their father encouraged them, but with a warning: if they wanted this life, they'd have to be tougher than anyone else. The industry didn't forgive weakness, and so that first loss became a badge of honor. They had been laughed at, dismissed, and beaten. But they hadn't quit. In fact, they began to chase every opportunity to perform, no matter how small: street corners, local fairs, cinema intermissions. If there was a stage, even if it was just a wooden crate in the street, they would sing. It wasn't about winning anymore, it was about proving they could be heard. But fate had another surprise in store. Because one night, singing outside a cinema, they caught the attention of someone who would change everything. Legend has it, this part is confirmed through multiple accounts, that the Gibb brothers used to sing outside local cinemas, hoping to draw a crowd. Sometimes people would toss them coins. Sometimes they were ignored. One evening, they offered to sing for a man in exchange for something unusual: a bicycle. The details of this story have been told in slightly different ways, but the heart of it remains true. The brothers weren't chasing money, they were chasing opportunities to perform, to barter, to keep their dream alive by any means. What mattered was the hustle. Even as children, they were learning the grind of show business. You had to give something to get something. It was this relentless hunger, sparked by their first loss, that began to shape their identity. They weren't prodigies handed a stage, they were fighters carving out one, performance by performance. And soon, their persistence would pay off, because someone important was about to notice them. But that part of the story is only beginning. The Gibbs' hunger for performance didn't stop after that first loss. In fact, it became more urgent. They were relentless, and when the family emigrated from Manchester to Redcliffe, Queensland in 1958, the boys carried their dream with them across the world. Australia was new, unfamiliar, and harsh in its own way. But the Gibbs quickly discovered something that would change their lives. The cinemas in Redcliffe played short intermission breaks between films. It was the perfect opportunity for mischief, or in the case of the Gibb brothers, the perfect chance to perform. According to verified accounts, the boys would position themselves outside the local cinema, offering to sing for patrons who were on their way in or out. Sometimes they'd sneak inside and sing just before the film started. Their goal wasn't money, it was to be heard. Their voices became their currency, their weapon, and their calling card. It was during one of these rough-edge street performances that fate intervened. A local DJ named Bill Gates, yes, long before another man with that name would become famous for computers, happened to walk by. Gates was no superstar, but in the small world of Australian radio, he had power. He could play music that people would hear, and he could decide which acts deserved attention. When Gates heard the Gibbs sing, he didn't hear polished talent. He didn't hear perfection. What he heard was something more dangerous: potential. He later admitted that what drew him in wasn't just their harmonies, it was their defiance. 3 children who had clearly been bruised by rejection, yet kept showing up anyway. Gates took a chance. He invited them to sing live on his station, Brisbane's 4BH radio. For the Gibbs, it was the biggest stage of their lives. They weren't just singing for a cinema crowd anymore, they were singing into microphones that reached thousands of homes. The performance wasn't flawless, but it carried something undeniable. The quiver of Robin's young voice, the grounding of Maurice, the steadiness of Barry's guitar, they fit together like pieces of a puzzle. For the first time, strangers who had never seen their faces were talking about those Gibb brothers. The phone lines lit up with requests for more. What began as humiliation in Manchester was now turning into validation in Brisbane, and yet success was still miles away. The radio spot didn't make them stars overnight, but it gave them something more important than applause. It gave them proof that their loss had been the beginning, not the end. Still, the road ahead wasn't smooth. Even with radio exposure, rejection would come again, this time in the recording studio. By 1960, the Gibbs' determination pushed them into their first serious recordings. Their father, Hugh, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his contacts and hustling to get his boys into any studio that would have them. He believed, perhaps even more fiercely than they did, that his sons were destined for more than street corners and cinema crowds. The boys cut their first sides under various group names, including the Rattlesnakes and later Wee Johnny Hayes and the Blue Cats. These recordings were raw, unpolished, and often technically flawed. The microphones were cheap, the mixing rough, and the songs a jumble of imitation and experimentation. When record executives heard the tapes, most of them shrugged. "Not ready," they said. "Too young, too rough, too ordinary." It was a gut punch. Another talent show loss, just dressed in grown-up clothes. But this time, the Gibbs were older, stronger, and sharper. They remembered the sting of Manchester, the polite dismissal of the judges, the sound of laughter in the crowd. Compared to that humiliation, the rejection of executives felt familiar and survivable. Instead of retreating, Barry began to write songs of his own. He was barely a teenager, but he had a knack for melody and structure that was impossible to ignore. He poured himself into notebooks, scribbling lyrics late at night, humming tunes that his brothers would echo in harmony. Robin, too, was finding his voice. Unlike most child singers whose tone often breaks awkwardly in adolescence, Robin developed a strange, almost haunting vibrato. It was a sound that didn't fit his age. It sounded older, wiser, and melancholy. Maurice became the glue, learning instruments, tightening harmonies, anchoring the group when the others drifted. This period was painful, but it was vital. Every dismissal toughened them. Every failed demo sharpened them. They were learning what no judge at a talent show could ever teach them: how to be relentless. Even so, one question loomed: was persistence enough? Or would they remain local curiosities, forever on the outside of an industry that didn't want them? The answer would come with another leap of faith, one that would carry them across oceans again. Because if you wanted to conquer the world of music in the 1960s, there was only one place you could go: England. By 1966, the Gibbs were at a crossroads. They had earned small victories in Australia, radio play, local fans, even some television spots, but they knew they were hitting a ceiling. Australia's music market was too small, too isolated. Barry, Robin, and Maurice understood a hard truth: if they wanted to be legends, they had to leave. Their parents agreed, even though it meant upheaval all over again. Barbara, their mother, packed up the family's belongings, while Hugh arranged the logistics. It wasn't just the brothers, it was the entire Gibb clan making the leap. They boarded a ship called the Fair Sky, carrying suitcases, demo tapes, and a fragile dream. The voyage was long, but for the boys, it was a mixture of fear and hope. They practiced harmonies on deck. They dreamed aloud of one day standing alongside the Beatles, who had exploded out of Liverpool just a few years earlier. They whispered about success as if saying it too loudly might jinx them. When they arrived in England in 1967, reality hit fast. London was bursting with talent. Every street seemed to echo with guitars. Every pub had a singer. Every label was flooded with demos. The Bee Gees, still virtually unknown, were just 3 more hopefuls in a sea of thousands. And yet within months, fate turned. They landed a meeting with Robert Stigwood, a man with an ear for talent and a knack for shaping careers. Stigwood listened to their tapes. He saw something others had missed. More than their harmonies, more than their songwriting, he saw resilience. He signed them to a 5-year management contract. In April 1967, New York mining disaster 1941 was released. The single was moody, strange, and hauntingly different from the sunshine pop of the day. To everyone's surprise, it charted in both the UK and the US. The Bee Gees, dismissed in Manchester, ignored in Australia, were suddenly international stars. It looked like an overnight success, but it wasn't. It was the result of a decade of rejection, humiliation, and persistence. The question that still lingers is this: would they have fought so hard, endured so much, if they hadn't lost that very first talent show? Let's pause here. Imagine being 9 years old, standing on a stage, guitar too big for your hands, lights too hot on your face. You open your mouth to sing, and the audience laughs. You finish your song, proud just to get through it, only to hear the judges say, "No." That was the Gibbs' first taste of the stage. Not applause, not glory, but rejection. Most children would never go back, but the Bee Gees did. Again and again, and every time life threw them another rejection, they remembered that night. When record labels in Australia told them their demos weren't good enough, they remembered. When critics in the late 1960s dismissed them as Beatles copycats, they remembered. When disco was declared dead, and angry mobs burned their records in baseball stadiums during the infamous 1979 Disco Demolition Night, they remembered. And when Barry stood decades later, the last surviving brother, carrying the grief of Andy, Maurice, and Robin's deaths, he remembered too. He would often tell interviewers, "We learned early that nothing is guaranteed. You have to take the blows and keep singing." That's why the story of their first loss is so powerful. It wasn't just a childhood embarrassment, it was the seed of their resilience. The irony is almost cruel. That audience in Manchester, Those judges who turned them down thought they were ending a dream. Instead, they gave the Gibbs their armor. Without that loss, the Bee Gees might never have developed the stubbornness that kept them alive in an industry that eats its young, because failure doesn't just bruise, it builds. And on that night, in a small-town cinema, 3 boys discovered they could take the punch. The Bee Gees' story is proof of something many artists don't realize until it's too late. Failure is not the enemy, it's the beginning. Let's strip away the glamour for a moment. Yes, the Bee Gees went on to sell over 220 million records. Yes, they defined disco, wrote some of the most iconic ballads of all time, and influenced generations of musicians. But none of that was preordained. What was preordained, perhaps, was their reaction to failure. That first loss taught them a lesson they would never forget. You don't have to win to begin. You don't need applause to find your voice. You only need the courage to stand on stage, take the hit, and keep going. When Robin once reflected on their early years, he admitted that the humiliation of rejection never truly went away, but it gave them grit. Maurice joked that if they had actually won that talent show, maybe they would have gone home satisfied and stopped chasing music. Losing, ironically, was the best thing that ever happened to them. It's a truth that resonates far beyond music. How many dreams are abandoned after the first failure? How many voices go unheard because the world said no once, and that was enough to silence them? The Bee Gees show us the opposite. They turned rejection into rhythm. They made defeat their rehearsal. They carried the sting of that small-town loss into every recording session, every stage performance, every moment the industry tried to push them aside. And in the end, the audience that once laughed had to listen. Because failure didn't silence the Bee Gees, it gave them their song. So what do you think? Was it fate that the Bee Gees had to lose before they could win? Or was it simply the resilience of 3 brothers who refused to give up? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, because every fan has their own story of failure turned into triumph. And if you want more untold beginnings, hidden heartbreaks, and legendary comebacks, don't forget to subscribe to RetroWaves. Every week we uncover the stories behind the songs and the secrets that shape the legends. Because sometimes the greatest stories in music don't start with applause, they start with loss.